if I'm going to indulge in a diet soda, I personally pick the one that doesn't have the sucralose in it. But I confess it's partly just because I don't like, sucralose is a little too sweet for me. That if I'm going to have a Diet Dr. Pepper, which is my preferred diet soda indulgence, I like the diet. I don't like the zero kind of brand, because that usually has sucralose in it. And it's just a little too sweet. And again, that little evidence of it having the ability to cross the blood-brain barrier is just enough to give me a little pause.
Dr. Ben Bikman, I want to talk about the effect of artificial sweeteners on insulin, because these things don't have calories, non-nutritive sweeteners, but there's some evidence that it can have an impact on insulin, which would normally only we would see if protein or sugar or something. What is going on there?
I put a link down below for my favorite allulose brand. It's called RxSugar. They've been around for a while. I'm a good friend of the owner, Steve, and he's a really cool guy that put together a real serious dream team when it came down to like medical advisors and advisors in general. So I'm happy to be a part of what they're doing. But there are also some really good tasting chocolate sticks. These are called their Swelthy sticks. Now they put these out on the market to sort of be an alternative for people to be able to have sort of a candy bar-like thing. The best way that I can compare it, and I have to be careful saying this, is kind of like a Twix bar. That's how they are. They're like a stick, and you bite into them, they kind of have a little bit of a crunch, and they have the gooiness. They've got a caramel flavor, they've got a chocolate flavor, a vanilla flavor, a chocolate mint flavor. My personal favorite is the chocolate caramel one. But bottom line, I put a 20% off discount link, so if you go to rxsugar.com/discount/TD20, which that link is just down below, that's going to get you 20% off whatever you want. But I definitely recommend you try the chocolate sticks, because if you're someone that craves something sweet, you could be literally surprised that when you eat one of these sticks, your blood sugar might even go down if you had it with some sugar. So if you were to eat one of these sticks, possibly with something that had some sugar in it, you might find that your blood sugar stays stable. Not to mention potentially some of the other stuff that I'm talking about here with fatty acid transport. So really wild stuff. So you use the code TD20, and I'm telling you, these things are the closest thing that you're gonna get to an actual candy bar without all the chaos and metabolic distress that comes with a real candy bar. But they also have good stuff too. They have their sweeteners that you can use, like a syrup for coffee. They have their regular stick packs that are just straight up allulose, granulated allulose. So all that is down below. So that link, top line of the description, underneath this video, please check out RxSugar, and also check out the dream team like Dr. Dom D'Agostino and some of the others that are on the advisory board.
Right. Yeah. So in fact, this is such a debated topic. Pardon the shameless plug here. In my book, Why We Get Sick, all about insulin resistance, I actually devote a whole section to the topic of what is the metabolic consequence to this artificial or even a natural sweetener. But these are these molecules, of course, that when they hit our mouth, they taste sweet. They activate those same sensors or receptors that fructose would, because in nature, generally, the only thing that is sweet is fructose. So they mimic this effect, and yet, as you noted, there's no subsequent glucose spike or amino acid spike. Certain amino acids can be insulinogenic in certain circumstances. And so how do we reconcile that? With that topic alone, which was the focus that I incorporated into that section of my book, I focused on the cephalic phase of insulin, or the cephalic insulin response. So the cephalic insulin response is this idea that when you taste something sweet, it's the brain's anticipation of the hyperglycemia that should come with that. Because again, in nature, there's nothing sweet that's not coming with some form of carbohydrate. Always, it would come with a carbohydrate. And so it's rational for the brain to signal to the pancreas, hey, get ready. There's something coming. And so the pancreas could start to trickle out some insulin almost as an anticipation, this kind of anticipatory response or to what it's expecting. But we've tricked the body here. And that's where the sweetener comes in. Again, whether it's artificial, like aspartame or sucralose, or whether it's a natural sweetener like monk fruit or monk fruit extract or stevia, or a different category altogether, a rare sugar like allulose. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as saying all sweeteners or rare sugars have been shown to elicit a cephalic phase of insulin, because not all do. And moreover, some that don't elicit, like sucralose, on its own, a pure load of sucralose will have generally no insulin response. Now, however, to complicate even that part of the answer, there's rodent studies to show part of what can determine the cephalic phase of the insulin response to a sweetener is the microbiome. And so it could be that someone's inherent gut bacteria alters the digestion of that sweetener or the response, and some person may drink sucralose and not have an insulin response, which would be more common, whereas someone might drink sucralose and actually get a cephalic insulin response. So you have some sweeteners that won't have an insulin response on their own, which is the majority of them. Most sweeteners, whether they're artificial, natural, or the rare sugar allulose, will not elicit an insulin response. Most of them won't. Some sucralose, maybe a little bit. Some of the sugar alcohols will, like not erythritol, like mannitol, maltitol. Those ones are generally more on the insulin spiking side. But even having said that, some of them can amplify. If you take them with a glucose load, it will dial it up. So if you eat a glucose load and you got it, let's say an insulin response that was an 8, now you take it with this sweetener and it went up to an 11, on a scale of, let's say, 1 to 20, which I'm just totally making up. So while some might not elicit an insulin response on their own, they may amplify the insulin response to a carbohydrate load. But again, it's not as clear cut as saying that they all do that. On average, I have admittedly a bit of a mixed view when it comes to sweeteners. Because in some people, if the sweetener drives a person to eat more carbs, then it's problematic. If a person is able to enjoy that sweetener, and if they're being honest with themselves, it does not stimulate subsequent kind of scavenging eating behaviors to want to find something sweet over the following 12 or so hours, then I would say that's a person who can handle it fine. And I don't know what the difference is between some people, but we know that happens. There are some people who, when they consume a 0-calorie sweet taste, that a few hours later, they have a much stronger craving for carbohydrate. It's almost like the brain is now demanding, saying, hey, you tricked me. You told me through what I felt in our mouth that we were going to get a carbohydrate load, and it never came. Now I am driving you to do this. Some people just don't have that, and they can weather the storm well. So my view on sweeteners is pretty benign or indifferent. And then when it comes to a population of people who want to maintain or improve their insulin resistance, then it becomes a matter of is there a rebound demand for filling that carbohydrate gap that your brain perceives? If there isn't, then it would be fine. But I would say it would be generally okay. But if we look across those sweeteners, one of the reasons I've become an unapologetic advocate or adventurer studying allulose, in fact, literally, we just published a paper on it, we're doing a human study now on it, is because it actually appears to be the most self-correcting of all of them. That of all the sweeteners, allulose tends to promote a greater sense of satiety than any of the others, and that could be because of its GLP-1 effect. Everyone's familiar with GLP-1 now, of course. I've had my finger on the pulse of those drugs since their inception, almost in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s. But anytime GLP-1 goes up, it will stimulate satiety very powerfully. That might be why allulose appears to be kind of gaining so much ground as a sugar replacement, as a rare sugar. It's not technically a sweetener. But with all the others, I'm pretty diplomatic about it. Like if someone says, well, I really like aspartame, I really like sucralose, I would just say to both of them, that's great. What do you do after you eat that? Or you drink it more often? After you drank that, or what are you getting it with? Like if they're going out and they would say, well, I'm going to get a burger and a Coke, or I'm going to get but now I'm going to get a Diet Coke, and because I'm getting a Diet Coke, now I'm going to get an order of fries. Mm-hmm. So they end up, that also becomes a complication. If the diet version or the rare sugar sweetener version is a pure replacement, and it's not acting as a way to incorporate other things, like say a box of fries on the side that they wouldn't have otherwise gotten, that I think is a good step. And if it doesn't stimulate further later consumption of refined starches and sugars, then I would say the person's doing it well. Whether they do it or not, I don't have strong feelings on. But as you and I mentioned in a side conversation, if you were to tell someone that they could never have something sweet again because they want to be ketogenic, let's say, then many people would just say, well, then forget it. I'm not going to do it. But if there is someone who's adhering to, say, a low-carb diet to get off their diabetes medications as a type 2 diabetic, and they say, one of the ways that helps me do this is I drink this diet soda or this other pack of electrolytes with this sweetener in it or something, I'd say, well, that's great. Don't stop. You're doing it well. I wouldn't want them to think that that's a uniform evil to be consuming this, rare sugar or sweetener.
It's interesting because the way you describe this, I've noticed there's almost two categories of people that consume artificial sweeteners or even natural sweeteners, whatever. I'm sure it's more complex than two categories of people, but it's what I notice, right? There's the people that go to fast food and hit their Diet Coke because it's habit and they're making a slightly better decision than maybe having the Coke. And then there's people, I guess I'd even put like myself, where like I understand the impact of sugar, and I'm not going to go have a Diet Coke with a burger, but I might have something that has artificial sweetener. I might have a Diet Coke throughout a period of time when I'm not eating because I want to sip on something sweet, and it in no way is influencing me to go eat more. It's a way that I'm saying like, oh, I'm going to have an erythritol sweetened beverage, or I'm going to have this because I feel like having a treat, and it's also going to make it so that I don't want to go eat. Like I'm having it instead of eating. So I think that's the big difference there. Some people will have these diet drinks and say, okay, well, I'm having this with my meal with practically no regard to how it's influencing their appetite and things like that. And then there's people that are actually doing it to control their appetite, and they're aware of it. So if I ever have a Diet Coke, it's because I walking around at a theme park or something, and I'd rather sip on a Diet Coke than be tempted to grab a funnel cake.
Yep. No, totally. In fact, you just described the way I use this as myself. That for me, it is only ever just, all right, this is a moment of indulgence. And I think we're both perhaps aware enough of our behavior that we would be able to notice a trend. Hey, look, anytime I drink this Diet Coke, I really start craving the funnel cake after. But if some people are being honest with themselves, that's exactly how it works. So those individuals, I think, need to be much more cautious with their use of sweeteners or anything sweet. In some people, tasting something sweet just unleashes the beast. And then it becomes almost impossible to cage it back up. And those individuals, they need to be careful. But even then, if they still say, well, forget about it, I'm going to have something, then I would say it is worth trying. It's worth experimenting with allulose then, which really does tend to have this sort of self-limiting effect, perhaps because of the GLP-1 stimulus, where it's you don't want to eat any more than you just ate. Whereas, for me, I could drink 44 ounces of Diet Dr. Pepper and want another one right after, because the aspartame is just it's so easy. It's so smooth, kind of going down. Too, yeah. Because
allulose is, I think it's slightly less sweet than sugar, so you don't get this like insane hit of it. All right. So Ben, when people talk about allulose, there's obviously a common discussion on the GLP-1 effect, on the glucose modulation effect, but there's also an impact on fat oxidation as well. At least it seems. I think you and I have both looked at the same paper, and it seems kind of interesting that it actually could influence our rates of fat oxidation.
Yeah.
How does that potentially happen?
Right. Well, in fact, I actually think you mentioned a leading candidate at least. So there were two things probably that explain this. And just by way of speaking with some authority, we just published a rodent paper that we looked at this. We actually measured at least mitochondrial function. So the kind of most simplest, purest form of metabolic rate in tissues, multiple tissues. And not only did we find that the animals, so these animals had an option. They had a Western diet, which is high fat, high carb, very much like the global diet that everyone eats, from Singapore to the US and everywhere in between. So they had this Western diet, and it was sweetened they had water with stevia or water with allulose. And the animals that were eating the Western diet, of course, got much fatter than the animals eating the standard animal diet. They stay very lean animals. But the animals that were eating allulose were significantly leaner than the animals getting the stevia with their Western diet. And they ate a lot less. They also had a much higher metabolic rate in their fat tissue. So what we found was by measuring some ATP numbers, we determined that there was a greater degree of mitochondrial uncoupling in the adipose tissue of the animals that were getting the allulose. And as a brief tangent, uncoupling is this. I always invoke the idea of an old stick shift car, which I just replaced it. But when I was driving my old Subaru 1998 Outback, I wouldn't even lock the doors on campus because a student couldn't drive away with it because it was a 5-speed manual transmission and no one can drive them these days. But anyone who knows the manual transmission knows that there's 3 pedals. You got that other dreaded clutch on the far left side. So when we look at the engine, I mean, if you're looking at the car, the panel in front of you, you have the speedometer and then you have the RPMs of the engine. Normally, if you are revving the engine, you are moving the car. And so we would say that the engine is very coupled to the movement of the car. And so that's very much the idea of how the mitochondria work, where the mitochondria, their main job is to create ATP, the main molecule of energy, or the molecule of a cell getting any kind of work done. ATP enables that work. But to get the ATP, you have to get through some energy. You have to get through some fats and some glucose products. So that's the electron transport part of it, where you're kind of generating the thrust that is ultimately leveraged to create the ATP. That is very much analogous to I'm revving the engine and I'm moving the car. The car movement would be analogous to the production of ATP. The revving of the engine would be basically breaking down the caloric substrate, the fats and the glucose. So what, in fact, through a series of papers that my lab has published previously, and other papers that have existed from the early 1900s, we know that fat tissue can have a varying level of mitochondrial coupling. So how efficient are the mitochondria working? This would be, and when insulin goes up, the mitochondria and fat tissue get very tightly coupled. In other words, the fat cell is only burning what it absolute must burn in order to create however much ATP the fat cell needs, which is very little. The fat cell has a low metabolic rate, but it's being very miserly, very careful, very efficient. However, when ketones are elevated, we've published papers on this, from animal models to cell cultures to human biopsies, taking biopsies of human fat tissue. If a human is in ketosis, their metabolic rate of their fat tissue is about 3 times higher than when they're not in ketosis. And that can add up. On a normal weight individual, fat tissue is about 8% of their metabolic rate. So that can be a meaningful effect. But even still, now basically back to the analogy of the car, whereas normal fat tissue is you rev the engine and you're moving the car, it is very tightly coupled. The RPMs with the speedometer. In contrast, when ketones are up, and I'll come back to the allulose in just a second, now you're revving the engine, but you're keeping a foot on the clutch. And so now you're not really moving that much. So the RPMs are going up, but the car is still just barely moving. You know, when it had been coupled, we would have really been moving. We would have been hauling down the road, revving the engine, getting those RPMs. But now we're riding the clutch a little bit, but so the engine is revving, we're burning fuel, but we're not really getting a lot of work done for it. That is, I believe, a great way to understand mitochondrial uncoupling. And when ketones are high, fat cell mitochondria are more uncoupled, which is a very beneficial scenario to lose weight. Now, interestingly, some astute listener may be thinking, well, what about other mitochondria? We've actually published papers on that too. And when ketones are high, muscle cell mitochondria are as efficiently coupled as ever. So the ketones are selectively causing an uncoupling of the fat cell mitochondria, not something like muscle cell mitochondria, which is a benefit. If you want to go out and get a lot of exercise done, then ketones would be problematic if they're making the muscle less efficient and the muscle is just wasting energy. But that appears to be a pretty fat-specific phenomenon. Now, back to the study. Allulose, we found significantly greater mitochondrial uncoupling in these animals. It could have been a function of the higher ketones because they were just eating less. They had much better insulin control, but also likely a direct effect of GLP-1. So as much GLP-1 has multiple effects throughout the body. And this is evidenced most especially with these GLP-1 based weight loss drugs like, Wegovy and Ozempic and all these other ones nowadays. One of the reasons they do cause substantial fat gain, and I do not mean for this to sound like an open endorsement of them, is that GLP-1, when it's activated, or that pathway is activated in the case of these drugs, it does cause direct fatty acid oxidation. And so it has a direct effect of stimulating fat burning. In fact, this is one of the reasons why. Let me back that up. It does help with beta oxidation, but it facilitates lipolysis first. So it has a direct effect on the fat cell of stimulating lipolysis, GLP-1 does, and then it has a direct effect at stimulating the burning or the oxidation of those fats as well. Dr. Mark Friedman, one of the leading authorities in obesity research for decades, suggests that actually could be one of the important components of the hunger controlling effects of GLP-1 drugs. That if you are stimulating fat cells to release more fat, the brain senses, even if the brain's not using it, the brain can monitor that energy, and it says, oh boy, we are flush with energy right now. We don't need to eat as much. And so that could be one of the mechanisms whereby GLP-1 is suppressing appetite, helping the person lose more weight by eating less. So to bring it full circle, I do think you'd mentioned it even in the question that one of the mechanisms whereby allulose may particularly be helpful for fat loss is probably the GLP-1 effect. Now that was the main one. Actually, when I first started this answer, I had a second idea in mind, which is that this is not published yet. This is unpublished anecdotal observations, but they are substantial, so I'm comfortable mentioning them. Allulose consumption drastically reduces uric acid. Uric acid levels, you take someone who is just stubbornly in this kind of hyperuricemia or high uric acid levels. I know multiple individuals who the only one thing they do is they start consuming more allulose and their uric acid levels just plummet in a way that nothing has helped with. Now, there are myriad mechanisms that may explain that, including allulose changing the way the body is metabolizing fructose, because fructose metabolism is the main source of uric acid. And Dr. Rick Johnson from the University of Colorado is the authority on this. And indeed, he's a collaborator on some studies I'm doing with uric acid and allulose. So the more allulose is consumed, the further uric acid drops. And the more uric acid drops, the more the body can burn fat, because uric acid disrupts that process.
Interesting. And then you combine that with, I guess it's combined, but also it is in part of the fact that, allulose essentially occupies some of the same transporter as that fructose, like the GLUT5,
sure does.
Right?
Yep.
So in essence, more than just what's happening here, more than what's just happening in the periphery. Literally in the GI, literally everything that's like from soup to nuts.
Yep.
It's like almost as though the body, I don't want to say it thinks it's fructose, but it's almost an imposter of fructose.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it is the kind of good twin as opposed to the evil twin.
It's just a flipped molecule, right?
It sure is.
Yeah,
in fact, it is really, really close. So me invoking the twin analogy is pretty apt here. But it's close. It's so close that it tastes like fructose. So it's sweet, but it's just different enough that it does not fit all the enzymatic pathways that fructose does. And so we do not metabolize it, and it does not give us, caloric energy. But it fights with fructose. Typical siblings, there's a bit of a combative relationship, which ends up playing in our favor in this case.
Yeah, and I'll put a link down below for, our mutual friend Steve's RxSugar, which is a really cool allulose company. And I don't want to make this, like a contrived pitch or anything like that, but I'll pop a link down below because they've got some good, like, almost candy bar like things. I've got a brownie mix and stuff that are really good.
I have no problem mentioning that. I think that to me, RxSugar is the most convenient way to get allulose. The way they've processed these into cool little products makes it really, really enjoyable.
Yeah. Have you tried the brownie mix one?
Oh, I sure have. Yeah.
No, that one's like legitimately, and I don't know if you saw.
I had milk. I had whole milk on it. To be frank,
I did too.
love it.
No, it's like you mix it. It's like a couple tablespoons, mix it with water, and then it's like microwave it. It's crazy.
Like 40 seconds, and you got a little cup of brownie.
I'm not hungry for like 6 hours. It is insane what I know.
Yeah, that's a staple for me.
Dom D'Agostino posted like his response, like pre-workout with it. It completely blunted his blood sugar spike from the workout too, which is pretty wild. Anyway, when I had Andrew Kutnick here, it was like we were talking about, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but essentially, his blood sugar went to almost 400 with the workout that we put him through. He adjusted his insulin monitor or his insulin pump to be high because he knew we were going to go through a hard workout. So it went all the way up to 400. And that's just to give context of like what a hard workout can do. And Dom used allulose before his workout and his glucose barely just,
trickled.
It's pretty wild, just the effect it has there. I want to talk just a couple other sweeteners kind of in line also with allulose. Like if you had to sort of rank them, I'm kind of writing them down. We've got sucralose, we've got aspartame, we've got...
Yeah, we have the sugar alcohols.
Xylitol.
Yep. Yeah, and so that's xylitol, malitol, erythritol. They're all in the same family, but I don't give them equal marks though, so we can still rank them.
So how I do want to just double click on erythritol for just a second. Just how is erythritol processed? It's mostly urinated out, right? Like, is that...
As far as I know, and I don't know. So not all of the sugar alcohols have the same... like on the kind of bad end of the sugar alcohols, it's either maltitol or mannitol. You actually do have a decent amount of absorption and digestion and even an insulin response. And then you have xylitol, which is substantially better. Then you have erythritol, which appears to have no response whatsoever. Yeah, but I think on average, not just the sugar alcohols, but even allulose, a lot of it occupies that urinary excretion pathway. So that's a main mechanism of exit for a lot of them, if it even gets absorbed at all. One of the problems with some of the sugar alcohols is that they don't even leave the gut. And so they stay in the gut. While you taste it, it stays in the intestines, and it creates what's called an osmotic gradient, and it starts pulling in a lot of water.
We've experienced that.
Yeah, everyone. If anyone wants a few minutes of humor, go on to like Amazon and look up the reviews for sugar-free gummy bears, and it's just people talking about these explosive moments. You know, it's just the most hilarious set of stories and analogies.
We were in Hawaii a couple of weeks ago with my. I'm just going to say a family member and he,
you don't want to embarrass him.
I've had him, he's, dropped like 70 pounds doing, low carb. And anyway, it's like and to his credit, like he still likes his sweet things. So he makes good choices with like, a sugar-free chocolate here and there. And he found the Hershey's sugar-free chocolate, and he showed him. He was really excited to show me. He's like, "This is the one that actually tastes like Hershey's. It actually tastes like Hershey's." And he's, I'm like, "Oh, cool." And I like looked at the back, and I'm like, "Oh, maltitol." I'm like, "All right." Yeah. And we were about to go on a dinner cruise, like on a boat, and he didn't have a bunch of them, but he had a few of them, and he went on there. And I remember him sitting there just being like, "Oh, my stomach's a little lit."
And you could like anticipate the Pompeo about to erupt.
Well, he had said to me, he asked if I wanted one, and that's when I looked at him like, "No, I'm going to pass." He's like, "Oh, they're really good. They're really great." I'm like, "I'm sure they are." Didn't want to like rain on his parade, but that's you see that, and you're like, okay, so that's what it is essentially. And if you've ever gone all the way with maltitol to the point where you've experienced the exit.
It's explosive.
It's horrible.
Yeah. So I put those ones really, really far down. Even though metabolically, because it literally just passes right through the body, you could make the case that it is the most inert. Yeah, but that comes at a hell of a socially expensive, awkward moment, where you can't go out with friends and be in polite society if you've consumed that, because you don't know what's going to happen. So on that ranking, I have no problem putting allulose first, and then I actually am very comfortable. Stevia and monk fruit extract, I generally give very good scores to as those natural sweeteners. But then most monk fruit extract and even some stevia is actually mixed with erythritol, which I give, of all the sugar alcohols, I consider erythritol the best. And then I also have no problem with aspartame, to be frank. As much as people have a very big fear of it, I think that fear is, on average, the research that show, aspartame causes cancer, just as an example. Yeah, but that's when you give a rodent model that is genetically inclined to develop cancer the equivalent of 28 cans of a caffeinated soda a day. And so as much as people want to weaponize those few studies against, say, something like aspartame, my counter always is, well, what would have happened if you'd given the animal that much sugar? Yeah. Not only would they have gotten cancer, but they would have also become obese and diabetic and everything else. So aspartame I don't think it has earned or is worthy of the bad press that it's received from most people. It is, in a way, among the most simple, because it just gets metabolized into some amino acids that if a person doesn't have a deficiency in the phenylalanine enzymatic pathway, and the vast majority of people do not, there's no problem, in my mind, with aspartame, as it literally just gets split into amino acids and then used by the body however it will. So if I were to kind of rank them all, I'd put allulose best. I do think monk fruit extract and stevia are perfectly benign and thus acceptable. And then the rest, kind of the sugar alcohols, get split up, with erythritol being the best. Aspartame, I consider it to be no problem. And then sucralose, I actually have more of a problem with sucralose because of the little bit of evidence showing its ability to cross the blood-brain barrier. Mm-hmm. So that's one that I look at with a little more caution, although that's a lot of speculative research, no real evidence in humans to confirm any concerns. But it is one that gives me a little pause. Yeah. So for me personally, if I'm going to indulge in a diet soda, I personally pick the one that doesn't have the sucralose in it. But I confess it's partly just because I don't like, sucralose is a little too sweet for me. That if I'm going to have a Diet Dr. Pepper, which is my preferred diet soda indulgence, I like the diet. I don't like the zero the zero kind of brand, because that usually has sucralose in it. And it's just a little too sweet. And again, that little evidence of it having the ability to cross the blood-brain barrier is just enough to give me a little pause.
What about the weird, the redheaded stepchild that's the soluble corn fiber?
Yeah. On average, I'm an advocate of soluble fibers. And then if that soluble fiber, is this a sweet one?
Yeah, it's like the ones that they're using, they use them in certain gummies and things like that, and a lot of keto candies.
So I don't know enough about those, but on average, I'm an advocate of fiber. If you're eating carbs, I'm an advocate of fiber. If you don't eat any carbs and you're on a carnivore diet, then the value of the fiber is diminished. And then I would just say it's up to preference.
Exactly what I've
always said. Do you like your bowel movements to be one particular way or another? That would really be the only variable there for me. But if you do eat carbs, focus on fiber. That's a part of that controlled carbs mantra for me. So yeah, I mean, if there are these kind of novel, maybe kind of like inulin-like fibers that have a sweet taste as they go down, that to me would be a pretty winning combination.
Yeah, you see in the fructooligosaccharides and all these different ones, which, I mean, they will definitely bloat you. But I've also noticed with those that just like any fiber, you build up, you get used to them.
Yep,
it's like if you haven't had like a, fructooligosacchariide or, something type gummy and you have 2 of them, you're like, oh my gosh, I could never eat those again. I'm like distended, but you eat them for a week and then you're like, all right, this is real.
You learn, you kind of metabolize it or digest it better. Yeah. But also just to bring it back to the earlier topic, these soluble fibers are really powerful stimulants for GLP-1.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so even coming back to this most obsessed over hormone and focus of these weight loss drugs, I am an advocate. I mean, the GLP-1 research has been fascinating. And as I mentioned, I've really kept my finger on the pulse of them, in part because my dissertation, my PhD lab, was one of the first funded labs by Johnson & Johnson to study the effects of these drugs and to tease out the pathway with these hormones. So I've been fascinated by them and long appreciated GLP-1 as something that it is in our best interest to take advantage of, to leverage. And can we manipulate our diet in such a way that it's still very edible and enjoyable, but we get a little more GLP-1? Then I think that's going to be something that works in our favor.
No, I'm totally with you on that. Well, Ben, where can everyone find you, man?
Yeah, thanks again. So Insulin IQ, if people remember Insulin IQ, whether it's the website, insuliniq.com, that's where I post a lot of my material, including some upcoming little mini lectures that people can access, and then my YouTube channel at Insulin IQ.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben.